No, please go ahead.
Should I be drinking or, like a lounge routine?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Saylor. I'm an associate fellow with the Defense Strategies and Assessments program here at the Center for New American Security. On behalf of CNAS, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel on Army Readiness. We're very excited to be hosting this panel in partnership with the Army War College as part of their annual strategy conference. Readiness is clearly going to be a very important issue in the future for the Army. General Milley has repeatedly said that it's one of his #1 priorities, and so we have a great panel lined up today to discuss some of the ongoing changes in the fiscal, strategic, and policy environments and how those might impact readiness in the years to come. Those of you who are joining, you can ask any questions to the panelists. You can direct those to them via the hashtag AWCStratConf or the hashtag StratConf. You can also tweet at us directly at CNASDC. So you have the panelist bios in front of you, so I'll be very brief with my introductions. But at the far left, we have Kate Kidder, who is our Basovich Fellow here at the Center for New American Security. She works with the Military Veterans and Society Program. Next, Dr. Andrew Hill is the founder and director of the Carlisle Scholars Program and a professor of organization studies at the U.S. Army War College. To his right, we have Major General Walt Pyatt, the Director of Army Operations, the Army G357, and finally, Dan Feehan, who serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness. And of course, last but not least, we have our fearless moderator, Vago Muradian. Vago is a 25-year veteran of defense journalism, I think a very familiar face to many of you in the room. So without further ado, Vago, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I'm honored to be here. I want to thank all the panelists for a discussion on what is a critically, I think, important topic. A confluence of factors have sort of conspired to undermine readiness and shrink the size of the Army over the past few years. Obviously, the end of large-scale operations in Afghanistan and Iraq had a lot of people going, okay, we can take a little bit more risk in shrinking the Army at this moment when there was a sense that there would be increasing investment in the Navy. And then, of course, you had a whole bunch of fiscal constraints that triggered in all at the same time that forced each of the services to make decisions that they might not otherwise wanted to have made. And ultimately, as you're doing this, operating the Ouija board, you end up trading away readiness, you end up trading away people, and you also end up trading away modernization to a degree, all of which has been done. And now everybody is struggling that even though the top line will be increasing over the coming years, even under the fiscal agreements, the internal costs within the department are growing, putting continuous pressure on everybody to do with fewer personnel to make some very big decisions on acquisition programs. And that's a challenge at a time when you're still fighting Al-Qaeda in a global campaign. you're fighting ISIS in a global campaign, and also you have nation states that are still, North Korea is still North Korea, China is rising, and Russia is becoming more belligerent. And as we saw in the European Reassurance Initiative, it's the United States Army that kind of has to mobilize and get in there in order to give some more support to General Hodges and others in that theater, who are extremely concerned about Russia's actions, and obviously that's going to be highlighted, obviously, in the Warsaw Summit now in just another 2 months' time. In the midst of all of this, Army leaders, I think, have been abundantly clear. I know I talked to General Odierno many times about, the readiness challenges that he was facing and trying to address, and gaps to prevent from forming, and that was still ultimately a challenge. And I think General Odierno, never somebody who was shy in expressing himself, did that to anybody who would listen, so that they abundantly understand what the risks involved with this are. The Army's critics have said, even within the service, that the service sometimes wants size over readiness, and maybe hasn't made the right decisions. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's still the greatest army in the world and critical to anything, any operation going on anywhere. The issue about size is particularly important at a time when you're dealing with a very uncertain world, where crises are developing on a very, very short notice. And so here, I think the Army has a very good argument that we may need a lot of people much more quickly and not have long, prolonged amounts of time for us to build up. And hence, the size, the capabilities, and the readiness are integral. I'm also fascinated to see whether or not some of the things that folks are doing to help the Army are necessarily going to help the Army. For example, the House proposal to add 20,000 troops ultimately, without giving anybody any more money to do that, does that end up becoming something that's a benefit or something that becomes a net negative? I'd like to encourage a conversation, so I'm going to start off by asking a question each to each of our panelists. We'll get the discussion started, those of you in this audience and in the audience that's viewing us. I want to start with Dan. Given the fiscal constraints, pressures that have been on the department, OSD has been pressing the services to make some of these trade-offs. Ultimately, give us an update on the overall readiness picture from an OSD perspective. And then the follow-up question I would ask you is, are we using the right readiness metrics? Their Army friends of mine have even said, okay, well, 2 out of 48 are sort of considered fully combat ready. Do we need to have sort of different scales, and that includes the Navy and the Air Force, but in this particular case, more on the Army side, are we using the right metrics to measure readiness ultimately?
Great way to start. Nice to see everyone here and on the live stream. My name is Dan Feehan. I'm the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness, a job that did not exist a year ago here. And so kind of as a first remark of the role of readiness needing a higher platform and a higher profile in the department. And that is the role I now occupy and attempt to grapple with the challenge in front of us. In fact, you definitely laid out in pretty good detail from the Army perspective. This is how I see the readiness challenge today. We have a conundrum essentially right now. We have arguably at the same time the most experienced military, most experienced joint force we've ever had. You could say in one way, but at the same time the least experienced when it comes to the training necessary for full spectrum combat. Essentially, the combat skills necessary to take on a great power in the world today, a near-peer adversary, and defeat them. So let's take the Army, for example. The Army has developed adaptive leaders in the last 15 years, all the way down to that E5 sergeant level, that O2, that platoon leader, in which initiative was truly vested down to that lower level, and you created essentially a total force of adaptive leaders. Yet, if you were to go out to the Army's NTC today, you're going to find a brigade. And that brigade, in all likelihood, just an example, that brigade is going to have a brigade commander who in all likelihood has not trained to full spectrum readiness since he was a second lieutenant. You're going to have a battalion sergeant major who has not done beans and bullets, the traditional role there, since maybe before they were an NCO. And they have purview over an entire brigade full of officers and NCOs that are a mixed bag when it comes to this, but who have all experienced some form of adaptive leadership. The conundrum is to take that and turn it on its head. But we can't forget for a second that how we got to this point. It wasn't by accident. This was a deliberate choice we made over the last 14 years to hyper-focus in the counterinsurgency environment, the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan, of what skill sets were needed. And that's not just the Army. That's the total force. And This took time. This took time to get to the place we are now. And so you can't forget those components, especially when thinking about how we address this. And at the same time, the last 14 years, we're now in a place where a central question that I've faced from day one in my office, well, ready for what? And this classic readiness question to drive that. And that's been kind of my first order principle. Let's grasp that guidance in strictly military terms. The services are left without what is an essential element to build readiness towards. So what end are we talking about here? And so one thing that I think is pretty clear, if we talk about 2016 today, you highlighted. Secretary of Defense highlights 5 challenges, 5 strategic challenges. The global counterterrorism fight, Iran, China, North Korea, and Russia. Here's your ready for what answer. Does that help? Well, it's a start, right? It's a start to get moving. So now, back to my point. It took time to get here, and it was deliberate. That it will take time and to be deliberate to gain that readiness back. To be still to this day sending ready forces out into the world for that counterterrorism fight, but to begin rebuilding readiness towards these full spectrum areas. And this is where we get into your second question on metrics. With the benchmark of ready for what, the services in my mind now have a very clear path of what to work towards. And so, again, it will take time. It will take stable funding. Because, again, the sequester did not create the readiness challenge. So as budget unpredictability is what it is right now, that's a critical function. If that doesn't get fixed, if that doesn't get addressed, it will be a strategic issue for the United States, unlike anything in recent memory. But at the same time, on this metric piece, we have to have a very critical eye, and this is the key third piece. We have to have a critical eye about what we're doing in the world today. Because there's trade-offs. The force is, there is a zero-sum piece here. The force can only do so many things at a time here. So essentially, the 2nd Brigade Combat Team does something out in the world today. There is a trade-off for that along the strategic challenges. So it's my role to inform the Secretary of Defense and balance this, to say, understand that is the requirement being asked of the Army today, for example, but here's the strategic trade-off to your 5 challenges of doing that and the way you proceed doing that. And that is something that the next administration will be grappling with. But I am fully confident that with stable time and funding and with an eye towards should we be doing everything we're doing right now, that critical eye towards what we're doing in the world today, we will make progress and we will get back to a state where we are full spectrum ready for anything the world would throw at us today.
General Pine, there are so many other things that I want to unpack, but I want to get through I want to hear the General's views as well as Andrew and Kate's. Sir, I mean, talk to us a little bit, or give us a sense about the trade-offs in terms of size, in terms of modernization, in terms of readiness, and why not accept a smaller but more ready force in the interim as you build to a future and a different structure, because the Army is working in a whole series of issues, right? I mean, there are doctrinal issues that are going on, there are technological issues, there are modernization issues the service is struggling with. Walk us through sort of the trade-offs of the thinking and why 20,000 more troops might not be a good idea now, or a very good idea from your standpoint.
No, well, thanks. And again, I'm Walt Pyatt. I'm on the Army staff. I'm proud when our Chief of Staff took over, he said very clearly, readiness is the #1 priority, and there'll be no other #1s. So that put us to work. What did that really mean? And really, my boss is sitting over to the right, so don't anyone ever think that OSD, the Joint Staff, and Services don't work together. We are tied on this problem set, very, very close, and he is one of the agile, adaptive leaders that the Army has produced over this last few years, but many years ago. But proud to work on this problem with Dan, and proud to be here today because it was, when you said readiness is the #1 priority, that question, ready for what? And the Army looked back and it was ready for more. Because global terrorism demand in Afghanistan and Iraq and all over the world, it was requiring so much forces and production of combat power for a very limited scope of mission. And it's called an assigned mission as a metric for measuring readiness. And we were producing it at very high rates, but we were producing it at the cost of the market. We were generating Army readiness called the Army. Really was the next person to go, got everything, and the person coming back, we took everything away from them, and so we had this cycle. But when you have a problem of ready for what, and really for the Army is ready for more, it's that the strategy is laid out from the Secretary of Defense, and the plans are required to meet that strategy of what if we had to do more? we had to get back to our core competencies. So to measure that, it's fairly easy when we look at it what a plan would call for if we had to defeat a peer competitor while denying another while still fighting the war on terror. Those numbers, only a third of our Army is ready right now. And that third is also the Army that's meeting that current emergent demand that keeps growing in Afghanistan and Iraq and against this fight against ISIL. This is a growing fight. When decisions were made to come down and look at the force structure, a lot of assumptions were made that we would be completely out of this fight and the world would look differently, but the world doesn't look differently. There is a lot of threats out there that require your military to be ready to meet this demand. In the Army, we pride ourselves on being a very formidable land force, but we have to be able to fight that fight that we have gotten away from for so many years. So we call that our core competency. So that readiness is not there to be the core competencies required to be able to defeat and deny another simultaneously while still defeating ISIL. This is a real challenge for us. So when our chief says our force is not ready to meet that demand, it's not. We need a certain amount of forces to be able to meet that demand, and those forces are at unacceptable levels of readiness. So if we had to go tomorrow, we would either pull forces away from the current demand. That's a very strategic risk that you're asking the nation to take. Or we'd have to send forces that are not ready, or we would go late, or we would not go. None of those options are good. So we've got to get back to meeting our core competency. We fight and win our nation's wars. And our metrics are simple. We have to have the people required. They have to have the equipment and they're able to train with that equipment in the environment that replicates that core competency. And we see this now. It's getting better in some areas as we execute our readiness recovery. And they have to have the leaders required. And one of the initiatives General Milley put into our measurements, our tenets and metrics, is leading. The leaders are there so we can measure discipline over time, education over time, and how we're growing that agile, adaptive leader that we grew during the war. We can benefit from that as we take those leaders that we grew over time and put them in now the demand to get back to our core competencies to fight and win our nation's wars on land and to do it as part of a joint force for our nation. So there's a lot of things moving here. To get at your last part of the question, from members in Congress, and they've been engaged in this, not just OSD. This is not, from my perspective, this is not a service competing against the department and competing against our folks at the Hill. Everybody understands the importance of this. No one is over-exaggerating the problem set because the threats and emerging threats, I feel, are very real. But when we talk about numbers, I think there's a broader context we have to put that into because we need to be ready for what, and for what is not answered by a simple number. It's answered by the capability and the capacity that we need to produce to go after the threat. Europe is very different from Iraq, and other areas are very different than some areas. So we got to build the force that is going to be ready for today, that can fight and win those wars, that ready for tomorrow. It's got to stay at the right force structure, with the right equipment, and it's got to be postured correctly, and it's also got to modernize, because what we see from other adversaries in the world is they are modernizing at an alarming rate. Technology is easy to buy, it's easy to get a hold of, so people we never thought would be potential adversaries could very well, in some areas, be equal to or surpass the U.S. ability to modernize. So all that has to be done in one thing. It's all part of the readiness. That's what the Ready Army is. There's no one lever that you can push or resource that will fix this problem, because we've got to be able to have that ready force. We've got to be able to deploy and fight and win or accomplish the mission with a joint force, and we've got to do it all at the same time while modernizing to be relevant tomorrow and not just ready for today. Comment more on that if we have questions.
Well, can I ask you just a quick thing? You said there were some things that you're seeing progress on. Where are you seeing progress, and where are you not seeing progress?
Well, on many things. One, we have a high global demand for forces. We call that global force management for the Joint Staff, and Army forces are assigned and allocated. We have over almost 190,000 forces assigned or allocated to combat command. Doesn't mean they're deployed and they're turning away at readiness. Some of them are rotational. So we have an armor brigade combat team rotation to Korea. And so we have measured that these rotational models can help us rebuild readiness. That we can put constraints. They're in Korea. They're there for a given period of time. They have access to all the training areas. They can do combined arms training at an alarming rate. Things some units would have to wait and maybe do once or twice a year back in the United States, but they're doing it every month. Same way in Europe. Now we've got a plan now that we're going to put an Armor Brigade combat team hill to toe. We'll keep them there constantly, and when they go, they're constantly training. So they rebuild readiness in the United States. They hit a combat training center, so they're at a high level readiness, and then they go to Europe, and then they get to build on that high level readiness. It's almost like PhD level training for them because they've gone prepared and they come back more prepared. So that's one initiative we're doing. We've also rolled out replaced Army Force Generation. This will allow us to sustain readiness across the all formations within the Army. So not one person or one unit is at 110%, while my unit down here is at 60%. That's not sustainable. We fall off a cliff, and then we have to rob Peter to pay Paul, and we're always juggling, and we can only produce a little bit amount. We want to be able to produce what's totally required, so we have to build a sustainable model that takes the operational and global demand, emergent demand, and surge demand, gives us a number we know we have to be prepared for, and sustain that across the unit. So everybody's in a band of acceptable level of readiness. It's very hard to get to, but over time, we've standardized all our training objectives. We call it Objective T. T is the grade you get for training. It's an A+ if you're in college, but it's T if you're in the Army. That's it. That's as best as you can be. And we have Objective T where you know exactly what you have to train on. There's no subject, there's no interpretation, there's no subjectivity. Everyone's training to a known standard against those core competencies that's required to meet the strategic planning guidance. We have to be there. And we also introduced a new way of measuring our individual soldier readiness, and it really focuses on medical readiness levels and of non-availability. And if folks are familiar with the Army measurement, they're familiar with that. We've changed that to now, in the Army, you're either two things. You're deployable or you're not deployed. And if you're in the Army, you should be deployable. That's what you pay us for. So if you're not deployable, you're going to work your way towards deployability. And we put it in the hands of company commanders and company first sergeants. These are captains. So that they can look on one website where we handle our medical readiness and see the readiness of their formation, their company. So 120 to 190 people, they'll see it. They'll be able to see the status of medical profiles. They'll be able to pull up Pyatt and say, Pyatt, why has he got a profile for, oh, it's just dental. I get him to the dentist. It has them access to the medical command to get their soldiers the health care they need to keep them in the deployable bin. These are all Army initiatives to get after it. And finally, the Chief has charged us with synchronizing strategic level readiness so that by 2020, he has been very clear to us that we're going to meet ready Army. We're going to get to that level of readiness by 2020. And there's numerous variables. It's not just operations guys measuring readiness. This is all our Center for Army Analysis, everyone telling us how do we get the leading indicators identified so that we can know where we're going instead of measuring where we've been. And if you're familiar with how Army measures readiness, every month I snap the chalk line. I know how many trucks can run, how many soldiers are deployable or not, how many weapons are fired, and that tells us what we looked like last month. It's very interesting, but it's also to get us to the future. So these are Army initiatives that we've just rolled out in progress. I'd be glad to talk more about them. But we know this is not something that our nation is going to solve with a budget or force. Army owes this to our nation, and we take that responsibility very seriously.
Andrew, I want to go to you. I mean, you recently did a study, and you looked at the future of the Army. Talk to us a little bit about what the right-sized Army, the right-structured Army looks like and needs to look like from the future from an objective standpoint.
Thanks. So I didn't really do the study myself. I was more cracking the web over a bunch of students who were doing the study. One of them is here in the audience. Ryan, welcome.
You don't look too badly scarred, so yeah. Thank you for joining us.
So I think one of the first decisions we made in approaching the study was that we decided actually to be a little bit agnostic about the size of the Army. The Army doesn't get to decide the means part of sort of ends, ways, means. It doesn't really get to decide. It can advise on the means, but it can't decide the means. And they can really decide the ends of military operations either. So we focused much more on the ways, the things that inside the organization, and that gets to your question about structure and some other things. Just a few really great insights that the students generated. First, the Army is an organization that is extremely resilient. I mean, the Army has a culture, very strong culture that's can-do. In the face of great obstacles, they keep working and they keep adapting until they've solved the problem. That is a great virtue. But the Army sometimes can be its own worst enemy in this regard. The Army, I think, has struggled in recent decades, really going pretty far back to at least Vietnam, to articulate to policymakers sort of the risks associated with different decisions, right? So if your culture is, yeah, give me the mission, instruct me what to do, and we'll make it happen. But let's say a policy you're not resourced for, right? What do you say then? You know, that's an interesting question. And so I think the Army can get a lot better at describing risk. And I know senior leaders in the Army are very concerned with how they communicate with policymakers in this regard. So we looked at the Army's culture and identified some areas that it can improve. The second is that the Army is, you know, the service that works the most closely with allies and partner militaries, right? So extensively. And I realized that kind of after last summer with the hearings regarding training Syrian rebels and whatnot, building partner capacity kind of got a bad name. But the United States has been doing that for a very long time. We've had great successes in Korea, Cold War, helping our NATO allies recover after the Second World War. That is a core of American national security strategy. You know, it's the pull of our values in our system, and I think the Army certainly needs to get better at that as well, and it can get better using much of the resources that it already has. The third area we examined was just actually focusing somewhat on readiness, but thinking about readiness in terms of, two kind of core mission types, and they're broad, right? So combined arms maneuver. Certainly, the Army is reasserting the significance of combined arms maneuver, as these two gentlemen have said. I don't need to repeat that, and that's important. I think we all felt quite confident that the Army is going to be successful in producing readiness for combined arms maneuver. The organization cares a lot about readiness for those kinds of combat operations.
And critics would say that's the Army's happy place. It wants to default
Right.
to that setting.
Right. Well, yes.
Because who doesn't like driving tanks in Germany?
Well, and there's a risk. Yeah, and there's also a risk calculus, right? So the Army leaders may say, look, given the choice between not being ready for a high intensity conflict and not being ready, what's the time factor here? High intensity conflict is likely to be decisive, right? And in the United States, we don't usually seek war. There was a recent exception. There was an exception in 1898, but in general, we don't really choose the time and place when we're going to fight. That means that time matters a lot for us, right? We have to essentially react to the initiative of our adversaries, and having established that, then you want to be ready for the highest risks. And to everything else, you have a little time to generate readiness and force structure as well. Because when the administration says don't size yourself for prolonged stability operations, that doesn't necessarily mean we're never going to do that. It means we got to figure out how to grow capacity when that happens. Because guess what? It's probably going to happen again. I mean, every time we say never again. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience at the policy level, senior level, but I imagine no one has ever sat in a meeting and said, I feel like getting involved in a prolonged stability operation. How about you, right? So, I mean, that's just, people don't choose that, right? That just happens. So we looked at that, and we were trying to look at the total Army. General Milley has really been emphasizing that the Army isn't just the active component. It's not just the federal force. The National Guard has an important role, credible asset for the nation throughout the post 9/11 conflicts. And the group had some really interesting insights regarding how the total force can help sustain readiness for the wider array of operational contingencies. One final point on readiness, and General Pyatt alluded to this. So there are kind of two levels of readiness that it's important, and I think we sometimes confuse the two. But his final comments about how readiness depends not just on the train, man, and equip piece, but on sort of, well, how many people? I mean, how many units do you have? How much force structure do you have? Because capacity matters. There is risk. Bad things happen, the unexpected. Our plans go awry. So force structure matters. Modernization matters a lot. In 1985, the Army spent 31% of its budget on modernization when it had 700 or something like that. And like 250,000 of them were in Europe and Korea, yet it was still spending 31% of a Reagan-era budget on modernization. In 2015, the Army spent 17% on modernization. And
well, because each body costs a lot more money
correct.
Than it did in 81.
And that's right. So adjusted for inflation, the cost per active duty soldier is 50% higher than it was in 1985. The Army's leader to lead ratio is much lower. You have more officers, right, per enlisted than you've had at any time since before the Second World War. I didn't look that far back, but certainly in the post-World War II era. So the Army's struggling with some affordability issues. But there's the, training, what are you training, what are you doing? But at the higher level, everyone in the Army knows that readiness, in a broader sense, is preparedness for war. So the Polish cavalry, when it rode out in 1939, those guys were probably pretty ready, right? I mean, I think they could wheel and do all those neat cavalry maneuvers. They were trained and equipped, and they were fully manned, my guess, but they were not prepared for conflict. And I think the Army, is acutely aware of the fact that it's not just about morale is and how much training you're doing. You gotta match those things to the evolving requirements of war.
Kate, let me bring you into this. I know you watch personnel issues very, very closely. For years, a lot of military leaders, and I know it's a calculation. I mean, I've known junior officers who've gotten out from each of the services. Army officers have said the same thing to me as they're getting out. That look, if I just read the tea leaves, there won't be, readiness is a challenge. There are equipment challenges. You look on what your command track's going to be. Who's staying in, who's getting out, and everybody's making those calculations. How do these statements, the perception of readiness challenges, the perception there isn't enough money over the years, impacting the ability of the force to attract the best and the brightest, which it's always counted on being able to do, to attract enough of them into this pipeline and then retain them over time so that they can become flag officers in the future, or at some point they go out and may work for OSD or something else at some point. Talk to us a little bit about how the force of the future, for lack of a better word, gets applied to this accession of talent, which is obviously a challenge for everybody in a fiscally constrained environment.
Yeah, I think the Army really provides us with a context to look at the impact of actually building into our personnel structures, right? So if you look at the Navy and the Air Force, modernization is key, and then we're going to the Marine Corps. It really matters who we have in the force. That's who we're supporting, and so. But the challenge here is both in. I have a high amount of faith in folks who are still joining the Army and the Marine Corps, where hearing that readiness is a challenge, they're ready for that challenge, and they want to fight to, be the most qualified person in the room. We're still attracting talent because of the mission set. But that said, I think that it's easy to think about modernization in a strategic context, right? It takes a lot of money and time to develop technology, and I think the immediate need for readiness is getting us into more of a less of a strategic thought about how do we build readiness and how do we attract and retain the best and the brightest, as you say. And I think it gets to what are we trying to retain for? What skill sets are we looking for? But I think the Force of the Future initiatives that have been rolled out I think they have ignored the fact that the tax on the chairman on unit level commanders is readiness. And so when we think about how do we develop the intellectual capital for the next fight and the ability to fight the current fight, what is the cost to the unit? So we've heard about a number of different initiatives, whether it's graduate school opportunities or looking at, being able to take time off and come back into the military. Those are really powerful retention incentives. But if they can't first meet that threshold of readiness, it puts us in a world of hurt. I think, too, it's been really encouraging. General Milley and also the acting secretary of the Army really talk about we need to frame everything in terms of readiness. And I think that's right. I think regardless of, the Army has no control over what the end strength cap is going to be from Congress, but they do have control about how they can get individuals to perform, or get more with less, essentially. And I think when you're looking at pulling in high-quality talent who are really dedicated to the mission, that really gives you an opportunity to optimize, even if it's a smaller force. I think, too, there are some out-of-the-box things that we're not necessarily considering as strategically important for readiness, but that are. So one of the issues that's been raised recently is that the chairman, so there is an Office of Reintegration under the chairman's office that was set up by General Dempsey, and General Dunford has said that that office is going away because his focus has to be on readiness. And I certainly sympathize with the seat that he's sitting in and deciding, where do I look at the data and we look at what comes after. The Department of Defense pays between $800 million and $1.2 million annually in unemployment compensation on the back end. And so they're losing $1 million a year to fund people who've already gotten out of the services. So thinking about ways that we can leverage small, impactful units within the military structure and rethinking how they fit into readiness and where we can kind of recoup some dollars, and also think about the service member in terms of the lifespan of their service and moving into the veteran space. Just been seeing how General Milley refers to the force. When he's asked the size of the force, he now says that his force is 900,000 or 1 million. He's including the Guard and the Reserve when he talks about that. Because I think in the past we've had a real bias towards only pointing out who's in the active duty service.
To follow up, and that's great. You fell into that trap a little bit because you used the 795,000 number as opposed to the total size of the force, which was a lot larger back then. One of the questions which I have is how both the National Commission on the Future of the United States Army put its findings out, and there are billions of dollars of cost associated with it. Some of these costs are for familial to keep the Guard side of the family happy, and the Guard side has a lot of political power, and so I can understand the third rail nature of that. But I want to get a sense for the readiness impact for the implementing some of those recommendations, which will be costly, as well as moves by Congress, which sometimes are I think motivated by the right reasons, for example, to increase the Army's capacity. But if you're not going to give the Army more money, those 20,000 will have to be satisfied somehow. And I'm not very good at math, but that's going to be a couple of $1 billion a year that the Army now doesn't have, which means it is a zero-sum game. If I can start over here and move across the field, and then I'll open it up to the floor for questions. But I'm sort of curious, sort of the tax imposed on some of these ideas that are intended to help, but all of which, again, carry a cost with them.
Yeah, I can jump on that last point first to speak to the force structure. I've had that conversation with the HASC, and I think you lay out pretty clearly, I think you've heard multiple times that if you laser sharp focus on end strength, you're missing the forest through the trees, so to speak. You are not taking into account what the total force needs, the balance we need between readiness, between modernization and capacity, and you're not thinking in a joint concept either. If someone asks me the question, when you think about readiness, what do you lose sleep over? I'll say it with a straight face here. I don't lose sleep over the Army. I'm fully convinced that with the right time and resources, the Army will be full spectrum ready to address any threat that would come to it. What I'm worried about in the joint context is what the Army depends on to be able to even do its role in that fight. That's our combat air force. That's our Marine TAC air. That are these forces that have been, the story of the Army is but one story of the total joint force here. And so when you think about issues like end service and end of that service, there's trade-offs there. And if you were to increase end strength there, require it, without the budget to accompany it, there'll be an impact. There'll be an impact in the joint force. There could be an impact in modernization. The unintended consequences of that will upset the balance of what we have. And there is no room for error. And so to the larger point on the total force here, the reason we say 980 is because there is a role for all 980,000 soldiers within there. That is why it is the size it is. There's a role for the Guard, which I was once a part of. There's a role for the active component. And there is a role within that joint fight for each part of them. We rely on the Guard for an enormous amount of things compared to fast arrows, and rightly so. And so to view it in that sense, General Milley is absolutely right to adopt that mindset when it comes to it. And to the Bill's point of it, ultimately, if you have a joint force of 980 that's able to meet strategy and are able to pay for it in a way that does not further offset the modernization cuts that we've deliberately taken here, then you do have a productive way ahead. But short of that, it becomes difficult.
Sir?
Yeah, no, thanks. I will just reiterate, I'm Director of Army Operations. It's all Army operations. So we always talk total Army and the Army staff because our deputy is a National Guard officer, and we have a reserve officer that does the thing. We're just integrated total force. The Army is like that. Every mission, our resource. Every single day, we meet emergency command, comes into our office in the basement of the Pentagon. People always say, well, you need to have access to the Guard Reserve. I have access to the Guard Reserve. I mean, the Army does. I mean, they're Army forces, and they're all part of the plan, all part of the greater O plan, or operational plans to meet the defense planning guides. You can't have one compo of the other. If you wait that way, you can't do it. Where we do get into challenges is with funding and authorization. That is not a compo problem. That's a total Army problem. So we lay it all out, and what we're trying to do now, what we are doing, is providing predictability, because the Guard has a very, it takes longer. So they have a 5-year model, and they span it over each year what they're going to do by levels. In the active component, a 2-year cycle, we turn it a lot faster because you have more training opportunities. That's all. That's the only difference is time.
Well, and you're full time, right?
Right. Well, that's what you have it. So you have full time, so you can make up, you can train more. So for the Guard, what we align them for is what we call in the Army now soft sourcing. So we give them a mission at the end. It may or may not be there in 5 years, but it gives them a mark on the wall that allows them to train, and their objective level tasks are going to be measured the same way the Army put out objective T. It's all one standard. But they know at the end of this, they may go do a mission. We just had 2nd Brigade, 28th Division from Pennsylvania, my home state, to Kosovo. It's a great mission for units to go and take these missions. We're always looking for what missions we have the authority and the funding allocated so we can put them in and earmark that. In 18, we're going to up our CTC rotations to making 4 for the reserve component for those compos. So 4 of those rotations will be for Guard brigades. And that's a significant commitment. They need that opportunity to do it. But over time, it takes longer to build the readiness. That's all it is, just a matter of time. It is a total Army approach. We have that. That's what we're programmed to do. That's what single day. Most of the enablers that we need to either fight a war, a surge demand, but most enablers we need to meet combatant commanders' emergent demand are in our reserve component. They're just unique skill sets. We have access to them. It really comes down to challenge. What gets articulated out of the building is just authority and funding, and that's what we have to go after. That's our job. We go after the best unit for the mission. Compo agnostic. We just go after it.
But the National Commission impact, I mean, what sort of impact is that going to, what kind of toll will that exact on this finely machined plan, ultimately?
Well, I think a lot of it is vested with it. We welcome a lot of those recommendations right off. We have to have a total readiness recovery is across all compos. And that training path, it's just different based on your unit. Every brigade, every division, everyone has their own different path based on their other demands. So we welcome a lot of that. There are some suggestions that come without the funding and or may impact, have a second order impact on modernization. So that's why It's not just as simple as talk increase in force structure, because then you haven't looked at what capability you're going to come down off of without the funding. When it's all balanced, then you allow the department to balance the readiness recovery over all compos to meet the defense planning guidance that's been directed by the Secretary of Defense, and that's
Right.
how we build it. So there's not we're not polarized on these recommendations by any means. I mean, they're very sound recommendations, but when you get into the details of what the second, third order impacts are, one of the future force, what Kate mentioned, is education is integral part of building readiness. You know, training prepares us for the expected. Education prepares us for the unexpected. That's why we have fellows right here at CNET. It's a big investment in our Army. We want our staff to be able to build it within the readiness path we're having. We don't want to just sit there and churn away and training and preparing for the expected doesn't build the force we need to face the future. Modernization is more than just getting a better tank. It's also giving a better soldier, and that's what you articulated that quite well, Kate. When you said the Army and the Marines have to face. That's our end state. That's what we produce for our nation is agile, adaptive leaders, and we take that very seriously. We welcome those suggestions, but when you frame it within readiness, you see that this isn't just something nice to do. It's not an incentive. You know, it may be the individual gets something really cool out of the deal, but the Army, our nation, gets a great leader and great soldiers that get through whatever education path or whatever path we lay out that have incentives. I think it's a natural build towards readiness.
I see you want to say something before we go to...
I'm sorry. No, Kate, your point really resonated with me. When I set out to create this office that I'm now a part of here, it's everything that we talked about, right? This readiness to fight. But very much born of my own experience, born of what I'm sure many of us experienced here, is this idea that we are building readiness for life at the same time. Literally, everyone takes a uniform off at some point, but it being a matter of time. So the investments put in there pay off not just for the time in service, we're talking about education, but for everything thereafter. I'd like to, there's a recent op-ed that I like to cite. I'm stealing this example, but I guarantee, see a lot of 05s and 06s in here, I guarantee you've A, seen the movie Napoleon Dynamite, and B, remember the character Uncle Rico in that. And C, I would guarantee that many of you know Rico's.
I've never been at a conference in 25 years where Napoleon Dynamite has come up, and
Uncle
Rico in
Uncle
particular.
Rico is ceaselessly born against the past. He believes his best days are behind him. I know many Uncle Ricos that I served with. And the total frame that you have to change that to is that while we are simultaneously building a warfighter, we are building readiness for life. The best days are ahead. And so when we think about the force of the future, how to recruit, that not just, how do we develop once they get here, but how to recruit. My long game here is that we have a post-9/11 generation that's volunteered in a time of war. If we aren't able to see them catapult into civilian leadership, in the business sector, into politics, into any sector of leadership in this country, then that's the future of the military right there. If I'm 17 years old today and can't see that catapult from service into the life afterwards, then what is my incentive? How are we, if I can see someone who's able to serve with distinction, honor, who found an incredible education either during service or after through the post-9/11 GI Bill, that's transformative. That's our future force right there, and that's a piece that really does resonate. Because you're right, this is born of a time of TAP where in transitioning was, hey, you're a quitter, get out of here, we're done with you. And that's where we lead to this place. That's where an Uncle Rico is essentially created, and not harnessed for the skill set that we have taken the time and money to build while they're in service.
Do you guys have any additional question, which I think was the tax and cost imposed by the commission, or anything else you would like to add?
Just a couple of things. One is there's a lot of really fascinating points that have just been made, so I'd like to pick up on a few of them. But anytime you talk about end strength, then I will just focus here on the active force end strength just for a moment. The notion that the Army, when somebody says X number is minimally sufficient, right? That's we will go no further. That is the maximum risk that we can take. This is the number. Well, what has to be true for that statement to be true? You have to optimize the organization. The commission was, I thought, sort of remarkably silent on the question of the Army's structure overall. The Army structure still is kind of the organization that was built in the Second World War. You know, and I've said this in another forum. If you were to build the Army today, what would it look like? What structure would you have? I think it's much more important to have a structure that is able to build the right command structure for a given operational context than to carry a command structure that is responsive to all operational contexts at all times, because that structure has really high fixed costs. So, you know, stuff like literally just shearing off parts of the organization, right leveling, you know, grade plate reductions. I know DoD is asking for some justification for like 4-star positions. That's being looked at, that's station for all of the services.
It's also being driven by Congress,
You
and
know,
there are members of Congress who've been pushing that issue for some time.
Right. You know, delayering, right? So our students on the study had a recommendation regarding, you know, taking out one level of the Army's command structure without sacrificing effectiveness. So it was interesting to raise that with general officers because they have interesting perspectives on that. But I mean, every person who works at that level is busy, right? So the question should never be, are you busy? Right?
Are you doing the right work?
Right. You know, that's the real question. So I don't think that we're not optimized as an organization. So for us to say, I mean, in terms of the structure, right? For us to say that, you know, this far and no further, I think we want to look hard at the kind of the back office part of the organization before we start shutting down the line, right? It's like we're shutting the line down before we've optimized the back office. That's not good business. So regarding talent, you know, I think things are actually looking pretty good for the Army in the sense that the U.S. economy doesn't offer many career paths for young, motivated people that provide the kind of long-term sort of loyalty, progress, you know, that the military provides. If you look at employment numbers in the middle class and income and so on, interestingly, the military is one of the only professions that's had steady increases in income in the middle class over the last 2 decades.
Well, and has contributed to the post-uniform unemployment problem, because as a vehicle mechanic in the Army, you'll make 30% more than you will in private industry.
But it also makes the military service, just from a purely mercenary perspective, I think, pretty attractive. You know, just pure economics. It's pretty attractive. The Army can afford right now it can. Who knows 20 years from now? But right now it can afford to get good people. I mean, I think, you know, there's a trinity in human capital. It's talent, which is inherent ability. This is not what you teach. This is just the inherent ability of the person. It's commitment on the part of that person to whatever it is they're doing, and it's the opportunity that's provided to them. So, you know, we can influence people to be committed, but I think we can also afford, and there's been recent discussions, some interesting research pieces. One of my colleagues at the War College had a fascinating piece on this. The Army, I think, can afford to raise standards for its personnel, which is probably wise, because as General Pyatt said, you can generate readiness faster if you've got somebody who's more committed, you know, more able to do that.
I think getting back to the commission question, you know, I have a somewhat cynical view on what the outcomes will be, just based on the fact that the commission report came out on a Thursday. The following week, we got the defense budget, which didn't support at all what the commission's findings were. And then you look at the HASC, their draft NDAA is in markup this week, and I think that supports more the Army side and not necessarily what the commission recommended. But I think if we look at the example that we have is, you know, not 5 years ago, the Air Force went through the same thing, and the real thing that we need to piece, I think the cultural piece costs minimal amount. If we think of how the Guard and Reserve are thought of by the active force, and there has been some tension over the last few years, and so if the only outcome was that this was kind of provided the opportunity to kind of air some of the grievances and have like a marital counseling session, if
like
that's
Festivus,
what it was,
where you have the airing of grievances.
That's a really useful, a very useful function for the commission, even if it doesn't result in kind of a strategic change that's appropriately funded and authorized to make change. But I do think that it all of the voices in the room together to kind of hash this out. And I think that's important. I think, too, when we're thinking about readiness and maintaining capability, it matters it matters if someone's leaving active duty service, it matters what their perception of the reserves and the Guard are. They don't, there is a pathway to staying connected to the military while re-engaging in civilian life in the Guard and the reserves. And so I think we at times have done a disservice to the Guard and the reserves in their recruitment and retention efforts by the ways that the struggle was framed by the active and the reserve component.
I now want to open the questions from the floor. If you could please identify yourselves, let's do that. Yes, sir. And if you could keep your comments succinct and the answers succinct so that we can try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. Yes, sir.
Cameron Luthi, Bloomberg Government. My question, do you see in terms of the increased use of simulation in training and the role that that can play in solving some of these readiness problems?
I can take it. Absolutely vital. My previous assignment I was at Fort Benning as Chief Infantry, and then in Europe as Deputy Commander, and commanded the training center in Grafenwehr and Hohenfels. Simulation, you cannot take an entire corps and put them all across Eastern Europe and say, let's go train today. You have to tie in the simulations. Requirements we have to be prepared for and ready for. Sometimes the simulation is the only way we can do it. And we have an interoperability that we can do with our allies. If you could do a full-scale exercise that would blanket Eastern Europe, and you wouldn't see the forces out in the field, but some would be live, and you can tie them in with the live, so the commander, who he or she has to make real decisions off of the real world unveiling in front of them, is getting these feeds that are just coming at them, some in simulation, some live. They can't tell the difference, so it's really a way to nest it. We did in Bavaria, where we tied up many of the cities with simulated brigades and divisions of opposing forces attacking a brigade commander in defense along Grafenwehr. And as he came in, even the simulation targets on his operating screen became live targets within the range, and then the live would start to hit the simulated. The field would come right into play. So you have to tie them together. It's the only way to get to the future. And some folks at the individual or unit level, they think that all simulation, you're trying to replace live training. That's not true, because you don't get the opportunity to do a live fire, complex live fire with Romanian tanks and German aircraft and a U.S. tank brigade as well. You don't get to do that every day. So, but if you can, the individual gunnery skills all the way up to platoon and company, and you get to do that over and over again, you're getting more repetitions at less cost, and you can tie it in with live, and you can do it, and you can change up the environments. We do it just even for our homeland defense, so we can simulate this building if we wanted to. It would probably take us a couple hours, simulate the exact insides of this building, and let policemen or anyone train on coming and do a hostage rescue in this building in simulation, so that they don't have to close down a city block to do a live training. They're in there, and it is real. The buildings are real, the floors are real, everything is real. You can create this. I think it's an untapped resource that will allow us to keep on moving, and it's one that we've got to keep pace, though, that we don't go too far ahead as a country, as the United States, so we leave our allies back with us. We need interoperability with simulations. We started to surpass, and I would always tell folks at Fort Leavenworth, apologize up front, but hey, slow down a little bit, because it's great that only the U.S. can do this. This is a really cool simulation. But when you still got someone back on Nintendo and you're on Xbox, you got to bring it all along. It's part of that modernization plan and fit to. But I think firm believers and an untapped, I think we're untapped fully what it can do to help recover readiness for all services, because you can't do a joint exercise.
talked about one technology that might be able to help us reach greater readiness. I want to ask about another one. So there are a suite of tools now that can enhance human performance. They range from the deeply uncontroversial but not implemented, like nutrition, all the way forward to things that actually work very effectively, but there's a lot of discussions about. And there's a huge demand from the junior soldiers for these types of technologies when they see them offered. How do you think about implementing these? How do you think about moving, instead of saying, can we get someone to the bar, to thinking about how high you could take them efficiently?
And please explain the technologies a little bit also for the benefit of the
everything from Defense Department funded research on simple transcranial, so a small electrical current that can go through your skull that enhances the ability to focus and learn faster, 30% faster learning that is maintained going forward, things that are fairly safe, and in between those technologies, even though they sound scary, very good safety records and other things. So, and when I talk on these topics to junior personnel, the question is usually, how do I get that now? As opposed to, oh no, we need to be careful with that. But of course we owe them the duty of care, but we may also owe them a duty to allow them to go into combat performing as well as possible.
Well, I'd like to jump on it first. I have some experience with it. I think, one, the human is really what we're trying to build, enhance and optimize our capability. And sometimes we rush to technology to provide us answers, and there's a good debate out there that sometimes the military gets blinded by technology. We become so dependent on technology, we forget that the real enabler is the soldier themselves and the brain that we have. And I personally practice mindfulness. We don't put electrodes in the brain. We just stop what we're doing, and it increases attention and allows you to focus while reducing stress. And when I was a brigade commander, we actually did a review, a study of this compared to our learned optimism to mindfulness-based mind fitness with our soldiers that came back from the deployment, from that recovery phase, and then through the next deployment. We saw very much increased levels of attention and also reduction of levels in stress. It's an area that the Army is very interested in, and it's very low cost. Now, there's a lot of time involved depending on which school of thought you follow, and this is really just meditation, but there are other techniques that we can do. So we all understand that when we try to prepare a soldier to do their duties, that physical fitness, you get a direct result. If you do push-ups, you can learn to do push-ups better. If you run and do all the lift weights, you become stronger. Well, the same is true with our mind, but we haven't opened up to some of the research and really looked at it and said, okay, what is available and what really does work? And there's a lot of school of thoughts. I'm not familiar with the technology you're mentioning, but I am familiar with mindfulness practices, and we've done a lot of work with the University of Miami, and some work to try to tailor it to what's easily applied to the Army, because the one thing we don't have is a lot of time. And trying to tell an infantry platoon to sit down and meditate and be quiet for 30 minutes, you get a lot of weird looks. But once they do it a couple times, or once they do it for 10 minutes, and they thought, well, 10 minutes is kind of manageable. I could take 10 minutes after my physical fitness. This is what I do every morning. 10 minutes. You learn to do nothing, to think nothing, to control the thoughts within your head so that you're not mind wandering, and the clarity and the mind and the attention that you get from this, and a reduction of stress. Because when we go home at night and you kick your dog, it's not because what the dog did. It's because what you did all day long, and you never self-regulated. There are so many techniques out there to teach folks to self-regulate, so that we're in the moment, and that moment is not tapping into an already spent level of stress that we've regulated before we got there. I'm a big believer in this. I'm having a hard time convincing the Army that it's as good as it is, I'll be quite honest. But athletes do it. And when a professional athlete finds a way to catch a ball better and run faster and score better, we ought to be paying attention, because we are athletes as well. Our soldiers are. And we put them in very complex environments, and we want them to be focused and have complete attention control at the lowest level of stress possible. You can't displace it with learned optimism. You can't just replace it with good thoughts. Sometimes it's very evil, and it's very bad. But you have to be in that moment in order to make that right decision, because you don't get a second chance as a soldier. As a wide receiver, they might throw it back to you the next time. But as a soldier, you only get it once. So I would tell you that the Army is very receptive to the things you just mentioned. And we want to put it all on the table and say what works to help optimize our attention control, because we feel that Technology is not going to enable the soldier so much better. It's just we got to start with the soldier first, and that human dimension is absolutely critical.
I think, too, that you're right to frame the issue of technology and human performance as broader than just the way that we train. One of the examples I can think of is, why aren't we rethinking the way that we structure our body armor? Or, if you look at what costs we're bearing in the VA for post 9/11 veterans, the bulk majority of it's not PTS, it's musculoskeletal issues, and it's not from actively engaging in combat. It's from rucking and wearing your body protection. So why aren't we thinking about how we optimize human performance in that way? I think too on the process side of things, I think an interesting anecdote is just how long it took the military to adapt the process of LASIK. Right, so it was in the private sector for a while, and then there was you can pay for it on your own, but the Army is not going to pay for it, and then all of a sudden now it's essentially mandatory, right? And so thinking through the process-making decision of how we go about amplifying human performance in ways that are a lot less controversial even than thinking of the transcranial issues.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. I liked your metaphor of the bar, right? So you can, you can essentially use technology to get someone from some average base level over the bar faster. And oftentimes, when we talk about technology today in the military, you will hear frequently the argument that military technology is so sophisticated that it takes longer, right, to generate readiness. So in 1917, the Army could give somebody a rifle, and so that was it, right? But for most people, really, when we think about technology, technology can facilitate some high-level performance in some areas. And I'll give a stupid example, but think about your taxes, okay? I mean, doing your taxes required math, like that you would do math, and you would know the rules and all this stuff. None of that's required anymore, So there are areas where technology can speed kind of that path up. But the other thing I think the Army can start thinking about again, because this is an area where we sort of, I think we're out of practice a little bit here, and this is thinking about the utility of pre-trained manpower. And I don't mean like the traditional individual ready reserve, but like rethinking the entire IRR, like just revamping that, because in addition to sort of speed the path from that level over the bar, you could also have a pool of talent that's in the labor force that in the event of a national contingency, and I don't mean like a strategic mobilization, it could be just, heaven forbid, Iraq 2.0 or Syria, whatever, right? Where we need 100,000 more soldiers in a few years. It's very difficult to generate that if you haven't sort of thought about how to expand. So if you have a pool of pre-trained talent, they're starting from a higher level. You still have to invest. We're not just going to hand them the rifle and say good luck, but they're higher up. They're more prepared. So I think the combination of what you're describing, technology can be used to greater effect, but also, really investing in pre-trained personnel.
Okay.
Andrew, I would say Kate's point is right on this. The many past examples of, despite science, despite many reason, logic, that there's an inability to be open to things. And I think if there is a moment for the Army, it is right now. I mean, this is a perfect example. This is a man spent his entire career in combat, in command positions, at multiple levels, where the main task is to get the most out of his soldiers as he possibly could, to be as efficient as possible. That's been his entire career. So if there is going to be an open mindset to it, it's this level of general officers into the next 5 to 10 plus years, the folk that will be in positions of leadership to be open-minded to things like this. You start to see the questioning of traditional norms within the military. There's this crazy example out in Fort Carson where they moved PT to the end of the day. Whoa, blew everyone's mind, and just like, what makes soldiers more efficient? Let's start to think about it, because this is spent literally his professional life's work working around this question, and this is the time where science and reason should permeate, if any.
The nation that harnesses the Xbox controller as the single unit of controlling every weapon will become the next military superpower, right? Because my kids can do things with those controllers True. I mean, once upon a time, I used to be able to do great things with those controllers. The fact is that I'm not trying to be funny with
Pre-trained
that.
manpower.
It's
Yeah.
pre-trained manpower right there, and they're ready to go. And you'll be like, you mean, everybody else will fumble with the 3 buttons, and they're just like, come on, what's wrong with you? By the way, my wife and I actually go into pre-tax training several months before the big game. A friend of ours is a gunnery sergeant. He yells at us. It's really awesome right there. Oh, I was going to say over, and then you can hand it over to your neighbor.
Hi, I'm Alexander Matelaar, a visiting fellow at the National Defense University. The readiness debate tends to focus on the opening stage of the next campaign and take that as its conceptual anchor point, so to speak. I was wondering whether the panelists would care to comment on how the readiness challenge plays out throughout any future campaign, taking into account factors such as attrition, availability and depth of ammunition stocks, and so on. Thanks.
Let's take the other question as well. Let's take maybe 3 questions and divvy them up and jump on them.
Sure. My name is Ryan McCannell. I am a student at the U.S. Army War College. Also work for the U.S. Agency for International Development. At the War College, we learn about strategy, operations, and tactics all together. So I'll take this opportunity to mention that same study that Andrew has mentioned will be rolled out here at CNAS on May 3rd from 2:30 to 4. So check that
Excellent.
out. I do have a question, which relates to Operation T and readiness and training. And the Ebola example is a really good example of something that's probably not in that suite of training. So I wanted to get an understanding from you about, sir, about, as you said, everyone is trained for the same objectives. To understand if that's mostly combined arms maneuver, or is it broader, for example, with respect to wide area security, which of course is a big responsibility.
Let's take those 2. Sure.
Well, I would say to the last question, it's much broader. So we're training. Objective T puts a unit, they have their objective measures that they have to do to be mission essential. So when we set up a training environment, we put everything that can play within that environment is put onto the military. So you're going to have to worry about displaced population. You're going to have to worry about terrorists. We're not going to just dismiss it. Folks think that the Army wants to just get back at fighting big wars and ignoring all the other stuff. No, that's all part of the environment. Civilians are part of the battlefield wherever you go. They're part of it. Disease is part of it. Climate change is part of it. Weather is part of it. All these natural disasters that happen are all part of the training environment. It's at what echelon, so that when you're at a company size and you're an infantry company, you have to train a certain level of tasks that will allow you to be able to operate within that very complex environment. That's called the Army operating concept. We know none of this can be assumed or ignored away in the future. And then, we really do. It's all part in there because it's very complex. So that's why the first ones that went were not the 101st from Fort Campbell. Actually, it was actually Army Africa from Italy, and units went down there, and we had to put forces from Army Europe within that. So soldiers are able to adapt, provide what is needed, but the capacity to provide for stability and wide area security within the larger context of military operations allows you that ability to tailor the units to meet a specific mission, assigned mission. And assigned missions are easy to ramp up for and go. If it's harder, if we get one that's really unique, then we will stop, train, equip, and go. For the other one on total readiness, all that is taken into account. So the sustained part of that is very difficult. So we have to deliver a certain amount of capacity at a certain level of readiness to be able to meet that demand, whether it be defeat a peer adversary and to defend against another one or deter another one simultaneously. And then take into account the generation of forces that are going to have to be required to do it. When we talk strategic readiness, it's right. Tactical readiness is what everyone's comfortable with. We know how many squads there are, trucks there are, all that, but it's the strategic readiness that the Army, really the Department of the Army, focuses on. Where are our ammunition stocks? Where are our fuel? Do we have the enablers to get there? This joint force to be able to get it there. Regardless of the service, the Army is going to have a responsibility for logistics somewhere in that mix. That is the part of the war that is not real colorful. They don't make movies out of it, but it is strategically vital, and it has to be taken into account. Those enablers, and most of them, that are critical skill sets, are in our reserve component. That's why I said we're the total Army, because we wouldn't be, we'll get there, and we'll turn around, and there will be no ammo or no fuel. That's not a way we win or sustain combat operations.
I'll jump in here too and take the opportunity to point out that our current CNAS Army Fellow, Colonel Val Caveney, was the Chief of Staff for the 101st Mission with Ebola. And so if I'm misspeaking, he can certainly correct me afterwards. But really what it shows is the agility and the adaptability when you have the right talent to bring in the Army, right? So USAID was on the ground, as were so many other nonprofits who are really trying to seek who do more development work, and what the Army was able to bring in was kind of a, set up the logistics, set up the operational, set everything up so that everyone else could operate efficiently, and then they could pull back. And I think that you only get that kind of engagement when you have critical thinkers and adaptive leaders who are able to be dropped into a situation that are, is not within its normal combat readiness portfolio.
We are now entering the lightning round, and so what I'm also urged to go to Paul to take a question from Twitter. Paul.
Very exciting. Thanks. We've got a lot of good questions on Twitter. I'll have to just sort of pick one out. Let's.
You can pick two out because we will be brief, and which one of you see which one is the right person who might be the right person to try to tackle the question.
Great. Okay, lightning round it is. So, how does the Army delineate between core competencies needed for future warfighting and irrelevant legacy competencies? Getting to this question about things evolving over time. And then for Andrew Hill, what would draw people into a reimagined IRR any more than the existing one, and what new resources would be required?
It's easy. We have to be able to predict the future. I mean, there's your answer. But we have to. I mean, look, think about that. So you have to predict what's needed in the future. You have to be ready today, relevant tomorrow. But there are some things you can look at. What does the environment look like? How are adversaries in the world changing around you? What could possibly be demanded? You cannot build. It's why just getting a structure right today is not going to get the readiness we need in 2020. Because in 2020, we could turn around and say, well, we built a good army for 2016. That's not what we're doing. We have to take into account what our adversaries are doing, what possible ways we can build stability and security and not just always have to fight for it. We always rehearse forced entry operations where early entry operations are a little bit easier and a little bit less costly. So there's investments over time to allow to set the theater. We're actually avoiding future possible conflicts. So we're not just predicting the future, we're also shaping the future outcome to make sure it's safe and secure.
And the second one was for me. Yeah. So the reimagining the IRR. So I know the Reserve Forces Policy Board had a memo last fall on this, and they're looking at this. Just a couple broad points. I mean, so how do you grow an army, right? So in the Greek myth, Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, takes the dragon's teeth and he sows them in the ground, and the army springs up from the earth. That is a force generator's dream, right? But armies are not built that way. They are. You have to train people, and then not only do you have to train them, but then you have to put them in a unit where they have experienced leadership, right? So there are two tricks here. We talked earlier just about the accelerating the training timeline, but the other piece is how do you maintain force structure that can receive those new personnel? And I think the Army's shift to this idea of train, advise, assist brigades could work quite well. So a cadre unit is like basically an undermanned unit that has senior people who, historically would just sit around and be bored and have low morale. But with train, advise, assist, you could actually have those people doing stuff, right, when they're not taking in personnel for some kind of a expansion in a contingency. So they feel like they're doing important work. There is high morale. You have good people in those organizations, but then they can receive that talent. Regarding the structure of the IRR itself, I mean, so the individual ready reserve was barely used in the post 9/11 era. I think the Marine Corps used it the most, just as a percentage. What percentage of their IRR actually were called up? The Army, I think it was about 10% were called up, and it's shrinking too. As the Army shrinks, right, the people leaving the Army, that population is smaller as well. So I would say that a good starting point would be to consider a limited kind of active duty National Guard or whatever commitment. So you have a very limited upfront commitment, say 18 months or so, where you have enough time to go through your training, your advanced individual training, go into a unit, do some interesting work, and then you get released back into the population, go to college or whatever, go to technical school. But you are on, I mean, you are in the reserve at that point, and you have received pretty robust training. And for some period, I'm sure brilliant policymakers could figure out what that ideal period would be. 10 years, I don't know. You can be called up without a strategic mobilization for up to, for the Army Force Planners would want, according to their models. I mean, there are ways to do this. Nations like Israel have a system that increases. So as the army is smaller, it seems like it's important to increase the number of people who have some military service, because that could help you in the event that you have to grow. We might have to grow again. It seems like we're on this trajectory where the army is just going to keep getting smaller. The army is just going to keep getting speed bumps on the way down, but that's not necessarily true. We could get a lot larger for some, heaven forbid, kind of contingency. And I think, so there are lots of models out there, and I think for the nation to look at and learn from. It's clear that our current system doesn't, I mean, the fact that we didn't use it much in the last decade suggests there's something not quite right with it. But the idea of a pool of retrained manpower seems pretty compelling.
And a quick aside on that as well, I think that really can assist in the transition process, right? So right now it seems as though we have people leaving active duty and then going off cliff.
Yeah.
What if we could provide, on both sides, it's a phased transition, it's an individual and it's an individual for the military, it kind of serves both purposes.
Any questions in the room before we take another question from Twitter? Paul, question in the room. But we will still take a question. And we'll take a question.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Travis Reese. I'm with the Strategic Initiatives Group. My question specifically is about the tension between readiness recovery and readiness recovery and particularly generals and chief cited deter and assure type factors, posture, those things which best stabilize readiness. Sometimes we kind of look at it like if you send them to training exercise, C1. If you send them overseas and then you bring them back, they come back C4. So what is the best balance between those two relationships? That which the prefer to have in terms of a sustained readiness capability. I know it's very complex, but I'm sure it's probably got some trade dealing with it.
I can so this is the kind of framework I was referencing at the beginning. Right? One that has little margin for error, given the size of the force. One that has to be done in the presentation in front of the Secretary every year, every quarter, every 2 weeks. The Secretary is presented with new sourcing requirements. And what's presented, the traditional culture back to the days of Rumsfeld, presented of, hey, a combatant commander needs this, just make it happen, right? And that's not a balanced way to manage the force, and that speaks a lot to where the force is today. The key in that culture shift is not just a matter of culture, but a matter of actually framing the issue. Framing an issue in a way which I described earlier. Sourcing this, here are the trade-offs strategically. So here's your trade-off in terms of posture, right? The command wants this is what it offers them. Here's what it provides to the shaping of their entire region, shaping the deterrence effect, etc. Here's what it'll do to the force. So say it's the Army. Here's the impact it would have on readiness recovery. Now between those, there needs to be someone essentially stepping outside of that, the role of my office essentially being and saying, here's the strategic trade-off, here's the tactical trade-off when it comes to the service. This is which to you has greater priority in that given moment. And it has to be literally fought one decision by one decision like that to get to a place where there is balance in a sense. And the service piece has to come in to provide that sense of, well, in this case, you know what, it does hurt our readiness recovery, but man, that's actually a really good use of us in terms of a good way to consume readiness. Versus, yes, we'll go out there and do that, but it really won't add much, that it will still be C4 at the end of it. It's not going to add anything or contribute to readiness. That nuance has to be built in there to that level of granularity. And in a balanced way that I want the COCOM to continually advocate for itself. I want the COCOM to say, I need this and here's why. I want the service and joint staff to say, here's how you can make that happen. But there has to be a third triangle to this to say, in terms of strategic readiness, here's the trade-offs. And that's how you have to frame each individual decision when it comes down to it.
I just amplified it. Readiness, recovery, and readiness is in the conversation when we look at global force management, which is great. It's always been there, but now it's really, really highlighted, which is good for the COCOMs, combatant commanders, and it's good for the services. Once we get the mission, too, we also look at how can we do this mission and build readiness. We look at everything now through the readiness lens. Pacific is one example. So our Army and Pacific 25th Infantry Division and 2nd Infantry Division, they do what they call Pacific Pathways. So they knock out a lot of exercises, theater security cooperation exercises and plans from the COCOM. Sometimes that's looked at as, well, that's not really vital to national interests or building or national planning, but it really is. It helps set the theater. These temporary exercises, this short-term presence gives us strategic access. It builds the partner capacity we want to do, but we have to frame the exercise now to allow the unit to get after unit things. So a no-notice deployment, emergency deployment that they'll have to get on boats right away and load their equipment and then move to Australia and then go to Mongolia. I mean, how do you not build readiness for that type of challenge and then build the partner capacity we need? As a battalion commander, I did not go to the National Training Center before I was deployed to Afghanistan. I got sent to an exercise in Japan. And when we were done with that exercise, we were so well trained because we had all the challenges except someone shooting at us. Because we had to get our stuff across an ocean, we had to deal with a country that had strict rules, and we had to fight through a language and cultural barrier that didn't want us there, didn't like the Army, thought we were ruining their land. I mean, we had all kind of things. It was a great, great training exercise. So we find opportunities now, and I know my General Love, my counterpart in the Marine Corps, we work for, we allow us to frame this. So it's not just a tasking anymore. They're not just saying send 500 people there. It's no, give us a mission. Let us tailor it to the unit so we can build readiness, meeting combatant commanders' demands, setting the theater, and accomplishing part of the national planning guide. So thanks.
Paul, one more question.
Thanks a lot. So the question from Twitter is, we're building forces and readiness to win at the tactical level. What are we doing to win at higher operational and strategic levels?
It kind of dovetails off this last question, and I think Chairman Dempsey, the transition from Chairman Dempsey to Chairman Dunford has helped set the stage for this. The world today, the challenges I laid out at the beginning, right? These challenges are not in isolation, and nor are these challenges necessarily limited to any geographic region. Take the influence of China, for example, one you could argue truly is global in a sense. So at that level, and this is where the Joint Staff is attempting to shape a new role here to essentially be an integrator of these things, right? And so, whereas the traditional framing, and this gets into Goldwater-Nichols reform and the things that DoD is currently thinking about, the world today is one that it's global. You can't argue that, it's more difficult to argue today that one combatant command can say that, yep, that artificial boundary, that's where my purview ends, and I'm not going to worry about what happens beyond that. I'm not going to worry about how to integrate with my combatant command next to me because, again, I need to worry about this. The reality has proven otherwise. I mean, the reality is that you have to integrate there. But the problem is who does that role. And I think that's where you'll see, my predictions, you'll see the Joint Staff beginning to integrate better at the operational and ultimately at the strategic level to get after these 5 challenges back at the end of the day. So that at the end of the day, it is not just PACOM thinking about China. And it's not just EUCOM thinking about Russia, but they are working together, sharing assets, and this is where warfare has changed in the last 14 years. We talk about our ISR assets, sharing assets in a productive way that gets after these threats together in a comprehensive way. That's where the department is shifting. So when Secretary Carter says these are the 5 challenges, they're not meant to be siloed. They are meant to be, this is the world's challenge, and how we get after it is a matter of building the right level of tactical readiness to ultimately get to the idea that we have to fight, but at the same time shaping operationally through the COCOMs and shaping strategically in a way that gets after the threats in a comprehensive manner where we have neglected to do so previously.
One very quick thing, I did get the wrap-up sign, but I just want to ask very quickly, why full spectrum readiness and why not targeted readiness in an environment where money is very, very tight, and you do have a multiplicity of missions, as the General said, as you said, as everybody said, that span across the spectrum?
the first step of readiness recovery, again, highlighted of a skill set. If you take an armor officer today who is a lieutenant colonel and the amount of time they have potentially spent on a tank over their career, and then the responsibility they would have of taking over a tank battalion, there is a skill set deficit. And so if we think in terms and mitigate in terms of risk, the risk presented by that person being untrained or unequipped, overseeing a unit that is untrained, unequipped, that's the highest level of risk possible. So you have to think in terms of the worst case scenario. We're downers at DoD. We have to think in terms of in that way. That's the worst level possible. But at the same time, you cannot throw out the skill set that same lieutenant colonel has. That they've been incredibly adaptable. They can take and field combat enablers in every way, shape, or form, and we have to give them space to build that skill set too, which gets more at the targeted aspect of readiness too. That's the Army's greatest challenge now. But luckily, guys like this have that forefront in their memory.
I would just add, we never thought we'd see another land war in Europe. And I was in Ukraine when Debaltseve fell. That was a land war. 200, 300 rounds of artillery every single day on known positions. We have to be ready for this because the environment demands it. Our adversary is not specializing. They've enhanced it. So we're seeing attacks on cyber, electronic warfare. All these things that we thought would fall by the wayside and we would move ourselves out of this, our adversaries get a vote of what we must be prepared for. And I don't think we're just making this up or just saying we've got to be prepared for the total worst. We're seeing the total worst around the globe every single day. And we build our strategic level readiness in the real world every day. We don't stop training. I tell people in the Pentagon, remember where your helmet is. Because you're part of this too. We have to train every day. We're part of these bigger exercises to get after it because the world demands it. We cannot just tailor a force to do a specified mission because you're never going to get there. You're never going to be there because our adversary is too smart for that. And they have now the capability to fight us in multiple domains simultaneously in a split second. And that's the force we have to be prepared, we have to prepare and be ready because that's the real world.
And readiness truly is a social contract. I mean, if there's any takeaway from that today, it's a social contract from us collectively to our service members that we will make you ready for whatever conceivable situation you might face. But secondly, it is a social contract to the American public that we commit, the United States military commits to being ready at the drop of a hat. We know we have no luxury in today's world to have a 2-year run-up like in World War II and say, all right, we'll get there eventually.
The one thing, I want to thank all the panelists, but in closing, I would say, everybody said not another land war in Europe. Obviously, you're right, Ukraine, it could expand. There are concerns, obviously, about how Russia will behave. The fact that, there hasn't been high-intensity combat at sea in 7 decades doesn't mean that it might not be in the next 10 years. And just like, when you talk to some airmen, the notion that you may lose large numbers of airmen in another future major operation is something that weighs heavily on their mind. I want to thank everybody on the panel, Dan, General, Andrew, Kate. Thanks very, very much for joining us. Thank you to CNS and to Kelly and the whole team here. Thank you very much. Well, it was an absolute pleasure.
Yes, I have the opportunity to say hello.